And we're live. Welcome to the Disruption Digest, the podcast to explore the weird, the wonderful world of AI in plain English. I'm your host, Jamie Hugh. With me is my co-host, Jarrett Miller. Jarrett, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you for joining the podcast today, and looking forward to the discussions that we're going to be having this week and in subsequent weeks.
All right, so let's get started. We're going to start with a very interesting segment called JobsGPT. So what I've done, Jarrett, is I've built a custom GPT that essentially lives and breathes and talks like Steve Jobs. So we're going to offer everyone that comes onto this podcast an opportunity. And the opportunity is to essentially ask this fantastic custom GPT any question that you want. All right. So you have the honor of kicking this whole thing off. You are the inaugural guest. So what question would you like to ask JobsGPT?
Okay, interesting. I guess, does pineapple belong on pizza?
Okay. Does
Interesting to get Steve Jobs' take on that.
pineapple get
Was
on
that
pizza?
discussion even had when he was up and coming?
That's a good question. I imagine that everyone's probably been asked that question. He wouldn't be human if not. All right, so here's the answer. Absolutely not. I've always favored simplicity and excellence in design and taste. Pineapple on pizza complicates that classic flavor profile. It goes against the grain of elegance and straightforwardness. It's akin to cluttering a perfectly designed product with unnecessary features. What do you think of that?
That is that's pretty incredible that it was able to capture how he thought about design so well. There's a famous story about Steve Jobs where the president of a different cell phone company asked Steve Jobs how he's able to do or have the iPhone take off so quickly. And Steve Jobs brought that president of that cell phone company into one of his stores and said, "What do you see? There's one cell phone that I offer. Keep it simple,
Yeah.
keep it great." So that answer about, or you can see that that type of story translates to his answer within ChatGPT around his idea of designing pizza.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? So there you go. That's the first ever Jobs GPT. So today's topic is Figure's robot that has OpenAI technology. I've got a video that I want to share with you, Jarrett. So let's have a look at it. It's only about 40 seconds.
Hey, Figure One, what do you see right now?
I see a red apple on a plate in the center of the table, a drying rack with cups and a plate, and you standing nearby with your hand on the table.
Great, can I have something to eat?
Sure thing.
Great. Can you explain why you did what you just did while you pick up this trash?
On it. So I gave you the apple because it's the only edible item I could provide you with from the table.
All right. So, Jarrett, what did we see exactly?
So we saw this humanoid-like robot interacting with an actual human. There was a scene set on a table in front of this robot where there was a plate, a cup, and an apple set on top of that plate. And the human asked the robot to hand him the only edible thing on the table, and the robot was able to survey the scene on the table in front of him and actually pick out that the apple was edible, reach out its hand and have the dexterity to grab the apple and hand it, also know to hand it to the human.
You know, it's hard to believe that this kind of technology exists today. I'll be very honest with you. So when I first saw this gave me very strong Terminator vibes. You know what I'm saying? I was slightly terrified. I don't know about you.
Oh, I 100%. I keep telling people that aren't plugged into this world, we're living in the future. Like when they talk about in the future, they're going to have flying cars and robots, we're there.
Yeah. I tell you what, I'll be very terrified if I'm not being kind and courteous to AI. Maybe they're secretly measuring how many thank yous I'm saying, you know, and they'll go after you in the robot apocalypse. Hopefully not, but
there's going to have to be some human robot etiquette.
Indeed. But I tell you what, there's actually another thing I thought off with. It's very impressive, but it's a demo of an unreleased product, right? And I've got a story for you that is somewhat similar. I don't know if you recall, there's a company called Nikola that produces electric trucks, 18-wheelers, right? And they did this like fantastic demo of this thing. And I can't remember, it was hydrogen powered, electric powered. It was pretty impressive. After the fact, a lot of information came out in that they actually faked the entire demo of this truck. So the truck had no working internals. The engine wasn't functional at all. What they did was they dragged this thing up this like incline, right? And they dropped this truck essentially at the very top of the incline and let it roll down this incline. It looked like it was driving, but in actuality, it wasn't working at all. So it just shows you that sometimes when it comes to these really fancy demos, if it's unreleased, you got to be a little bit skeptical. What do you think?
Oh, 100%. I think everybody on LinkedIn has probably seen that video of the tech engineers giving a demo where the guy's like rolling a piece of paper towel down the ramp and then having to flip the switch of the fan on themselves. And I think that there's probably some of that going on in here. I kind of might think that I saw some evidence of the robot actually being a CGI and not an actual robot. Looked like there was a little bit of a jump in the picture whenever it went from the robot dropping the apple and the human catching it. So I don't know, but that could have been a very easily staged, simple task for that robot to perform.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things we've got to look at. First of all, I'll be very interested to see why you think it's CGI. And the second thing is, even if it wasn't CGI, to your point, did they manage to completely program this whole demo? You never know, right? Mm-hmm. So it looks like it's fully interactive, fully live in the moment, real time demo, but in actuality, it was completely planned down to the exact actions and where the guy's supposed to be standing.
So there's a couple things that I see that it might be CGI. One is whenever he dropped the apple, it looked like there's a little bit of a splice of the video feed to where there was like a little bit of a jump of the apple. Then the human or the robot itself looks a little too perfect. There's not like other shadows or some deformations on the actual robot itself. Maybe that's because it's brand new and that's just how it's manufactured. But then a little bit later on in the video, the robot picks up a cup that's sitting in front of him on the table and places it in a drying rack. Whenever he releases the cup, that cup has some weird, not quite real world physics of it tipping over and falling. It looks a little slow compared to what I would expect to see in real life.
Very possible. Let's just give some feedback to the CEO. I think your product is too perfect. It was too precise. Make sure you beat up your robot a little bit and make it look a little bit more realistic.
Yeah, or just have the human go over there and touch the robot and say, see, it is real.
There you go. Speaking of humans, let me ask you about this. In this communication, in the voice of the robot, I noticed that it said the word right? It was using filler words. Mm-hmm. I gave you the apple because it's the edible item, something like this. That's very strange, right? I mean, that's very human-like. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I see the utility of it. I mean, I guess it makes you more comfortable with the actual robot itself instead of it being this perfectly articulate being. So I guess it can increase your comfort level around it, but I don't quite see what other utility would serve other than that. What about you?
I think this raises a very interesting question, which is, do we want robots to look and to pretend to be human, right? And it's a property, I believe it's called anthropomorphism, right? So is there any advantages to that? I'm not sure. I feel like we do that a lot with other things, animals especially, where we draw, if you think of Disney cartoons, they always look very human. And I believe they remade I don't know if you remember this, they remade Lion King and they made it a lot more realistic, and people complained because it didn't have human eyes. It couldn't carry the same level of emotion. So could it be that we need emotion and connection in order to really get to grips with something? Is that what's needed? And by having a more human touch, that's facilitated?
I guess going back to what is the benefit of having that emotional connection with this thing? Is it to drive adoption and use of this thing, or is it uh, to alleviate fears that it's here to take over?
Right. And another thing is, does it put itself into the uncanny valley?
Explain
Right.
the uncanny valley.
Well, okay. So basically, we're talking about how similar something is to a human, right? And so if it's completely dissimilar, then you're not afraid of it. It looks completely different. As it gets closer and closer to becoming human, we basically get through this really weird area where something looks kind of like human, but you know there's something not quite right. And I believe it's some kind of natural reaction that we have to things that are not quite right. You know there's something wrong with it,
Mm-hmm.
and it draws a very powerful emotion. So is it trying too hard? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, so why make this thing look like and behave exactly like a human? You could still have that dialogue with this robot if it wasn't shaped and have the mechanics of a human. I mean, I would assume that there's some better way to make this thing move and grab things and not be shaped and have a head and shoulders
Yeah.
and two arms. So what is there a better way out there to do this? But you still have that ability to ask it questions, give it commands, and it do tasks for you.
Exactly. Speaking of which, I was trying to figure this out. Do you think because this is complicated, Jarrett, right? This is a very complicated setup. There's a lot of dexterity when it comes to the arm motions and everything. In order for this to work, it has to have very accurate sensors. I was trying to figure out where the sensors would be optimally placed. I'm assuming this thing is fixed in place for power reasons, right? You would want a power cable running up to it, so the amount of movement on its base may be limited. And then my question would be, do you think it would make sense to have powerful cameras fixed from maybe up above to give an additional sensor, or how would that even work, do you think?
I think it depends on the task that it's doing. So if it's doing a task where it can just sit at a station and move arms and move objects around, and that's the task that is required of it,
Yeah.
then there's still a lot of high utility there. But if it's like this robot needs to analyze a scene and pick up and carry this object from one place to another, then it's going to be a lot more difficult. So it comes down to use case, I think, as to how feasible these robots are going to be, and whether or not they're actually going to be useful in day-to-day life or in industrial manufacturing settings.
Speaking of which, let's dive into that a little bit. What can we use this kind of robot for?
So my dad actually used to own an engineering firm where they actually create these robots, or not these robots that are similar, but they have you've probably seen them. They've got arms. They'll go and pick up something and just follow a prescribed path, and it's a repetitive task. It does the exact same thing over and over again. It might pick up a widget coming off an assembly line and move it over 10 feet and drop it into a box. So it's performing this exact repetitive task over and over again. But the problem with these robots is that they're very expensive, and there's two main costs. There's the actual cost of the robot itself, and there's the cost to program this robot and integrate it into your company's workflows to make it work for your particular manufacturing space. So problem is that the tasks that this robot is able to do is very low skill and low cost labor to be able to replace. But these robots can be millions of dollars. So it's very difficult to justify the cost of one of these robots, especially seemingly one as complex as what they just showed here. But there's two main ways that you can justify the cost of these robots. And that's on if this robot can do the job faster than a human can, and therefore you can increase production capacity of your facility. But there's another use case that I've seen in a previous role that I was in. If there is not labor in the geographic location that you're trying to set up operations in, you can use these type of robots to actually be that labor and run autonomous operations. So the use cases here are there's a lot in oil and gas, in mining, and in other manufacturing spaces where you're tied to a certain geographic location that's maybe super remote and nobody wants to go out there and work. You can deploy these type of robots to actually allow you to have production in these remote areas. So that's increased production. And then the other area is of easy justification is around safety. So if you can increase safety in some sort of operation, then that's a very easy justification to make the investment in one of these robots.
Okay, let me ask you about the first. You mentioned, let's say this operations is really remote, it's hard to find labor, and this could be a great use case. Is the requirement in that instance to have the workforce totally automated? So let's say this robot can do 90% of the job, but requires humans to be there for 10%. Does that sort of defeat the purpose, or do you think there's still value there?
So from the discussions that I had around this idea, the North Star is eventually 100% autonomous operations. You have robots out there performing every single job task. Now, the operations for these type or the day-to-day runnings of these type of operations is very simple. You might just have to go turn a couple valves here and there, but if it gets much more complex, then the ability to run completely autonomously decreases, or it becomes much more expensive. So the idea was where you can only get a few people to go out there and work, but you actually need a maybe double or triple the number of people to go do this, then the robots are the way to offset this inability to hire more people. So you still need more. One thing that I saw that people could not solve was when the robot breaks, who's going to fix the robot? So if you're relying on robots to stay out there and keep your facilities up and running, then if one of those robots goes down, it costs you a lot of money per hour for that robot to be down, because now your entire facility is down. But if you have a couple people out there to go out there and fix the robots once the robot goes down, then you get that robot up and running. So the ideas, I won't say was to never completely replace humans and run autonomously, but it will enable new remote areas of working that are not currently available today because of the lack of workforce.
I would argue if a robot breaks down, then you should build a robot to fix the said robot.
And that was one of the ideas that I saw out there. Was like, you saw the Boston Dynamics dog robot. I saw one guy was like, okay, well, these things have maintenance issues. What if we get one of those Boston Dynamics dogs to go out and fix the other Boston Dynamics dogs?
It's just a chain. It's just a chain. If you have one problem that the entire family runs on, then the whole operation just shuts down, and then billions of dollars are lost.
Exactly.
Just call it quits. That's funny. Well, from my side, I was thinking about this. I spent a lot of time in manufacturing, and if you think of the manufacturing value chain, the high value automation pieces are essentially done, right? If you look at a car production line, that whole methodology of producing cars is somewhat automated using robots already, right? So that's high value processes done. And so then we have to ask ourselves the question, what can this robot do that humans don't want to do or can't do or is better at humans at, that isn't already solved? And there might be a couple of edge cases. Nonetheless, there is a very interesting use case out there by Mercedes. So I'm going to share my screen and let's have a look at it. So this is a very interesting one because Mercedes have built these robots, and it looks pretty similar to the Figure 1 robot, right? So we see, I tell you what makes me laugh. It's the bloody eyes on this robot. Do you see that, Jarrett? They put eyes and a bit of an eyebrow on top of this robot to make it look more friendly.
They could have done a better job with the eyebrow. It just looks like an upside down face.
Yeah. Well, now you mention it, yeah, indeed. So nonetheless, they built this robot, and I quote here, "The announcement suggests Mercedes may use Apollo to inspect vehicle parts, bring parts to the assembly line for human workers to assemble, and deliver kitted parts, to name a few potential use cases." So I guess what they're trying to say is there are still certain tasks that are currently done by humans, usually just moving items around the facility, right, around the plant. And this robot may be a little bit better for that particular use case. maybe because of safety. Because if you're moving really heavy parts, you might need to use the forklift. That creates issues. Maybe this robot can handle it. So I think safety is definitely a great use case that you brought up. But it's interesting that they are investigating this from multiple different directions, many different companies, right? Not just one company, but Mercedes as well. And there appears to be some kind of market for it. On the topic of safety, Tesla have something very similar. It's called the Optimus, right? And I think what Elon's thinking about is, can we use this kind of robot to go to Mars? So it's certainly very interesting. There's all these different use cases, you know?
Yeah, I see that that is a use case, but how valuable is that use case? Can you justify spending the money for a robot that's just going to run some errands for you? I could see maybe if these assembly parts are hundreds of pounds and it can reduce the strain on a worker's back or whatever, you could justify it under safety. But is there ever going to be a market out there for a mass market out there for these types of robots outside of a robot just to grab some headlines and show that, hey, we're Mercedes-Benz and we're innovative? What are your thoughts?
Indeed. I don't know. I mean, it's a great question, right? So the question is it too expensive to replace manual labor? I think it really depends on the cost of the robot. So if it's $10,000 versus $1 million, I think that changes the equation dramatically, right? So until we kind of figure out what is the average cost, not only to run the robot, to buy the robot, but to operate it and everything, we don't really know.
So one question I have around these robots is, if you're using AI to give it commands, tell it, hey, pick up this part and go take it to Steve over there on the assembly line. What happens when you give that robot a command and the LLM hallucinates? Then you could have a major safety issue on your hands.
Right, and who's liable, right? So let's say it causes a big accident, who's liable? Is it the LLM that's liable because it misunderstood, or is it the human? So I think it raises a lot of interesting questions, and we probably don't have answers. And this really also depends on the ability for this thing to reason, right? Mm-hmm. So we've seen the Figure robot with OpenAI in the background working together. And one of the weaknesses that we know that currently sits within large language models is the ability for it to reason as good as a human. So what if you're asking it to give it a task, you're asking it to do something, and it doesn't quite join the dots? As humans, we're able to fill in the gaps and maybe even ask questions to clarify. But with this robot, is it just going off and do it? And then is that a problem? So does that mean, Jarrett, that the use cases have to be limited? We can't just treat this as a human. Of course, it can help us do things, but it has a certain pre-planned list of things I can do, right?
In my mind, the way I see it right now is that there is this North Star of having this robot being able to get all the way to it acts and behaves exactly like a human and reasons exactly like a human. I don't see it getting there anytime soon, but that doesn't mean we can start progressing that way. So today we'll get to maybe 25 or 30% of the way to that, where you can give it some boundaries and give it some actionable commands that it can know and understand and perform those tasks. But anything outside of that, it's not going to be allowed to go do. But as time progresses and as these LLMs get better, and as the robot technology and the dexterity of these things gets better and also cheaper, then I can see it creeping towards that North Star of, yes, you can tell it to do anything you want it to. It can have the dexterity and the understanding and the reasoning capabilities to go and do more complex tasks.
What do you think is the limiting factor to how quickly we can develop? Do you think it's the physical side of the robot not keeping up? Or do you think it's maybe the software side, the large language models? What do you think is going to slow the progress down? What is the limiting factor? There's
two that I see. One is the actual physical components of the robot being able to handle more complex tasks. And I'm pretty sure that out there right now, it's difficult to have a robot just go and do any task you want. A lot of the times these robots are are precisely pre-programmed to do specific tasks. So it's not easy for a robot to act like a hand and just go and pick up something brand new. There's a lot of tools out there that try to act like a hand, but they don't perform that well just yet to be able to mimic a human. Limitation I see is just the adoption of these tools. Manufacturing is typically a laggard as far as adoption of new technologies, and I don't see that changing with this particular technology. I think from what I've seen, people are investigating it, looking at it, but nobody's formulated a great idea of exactly how it is they're going to adopt this.
All right, I think it's going to be interesting, Jarrett. There's going to be a lot of unanswered questions as we move forwards, and it's certainly something I really didn't think about when this whole AI thing took off. So, got to keep an eye on this thing. What do you think?
The next 5 years or so are going to be intriguing, is to see where we land with these technologies. How adopted are they in the industry, and what other use cases of marrying LLMs with other existing technologies out there to create value in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, that's all we have time for today. Appreciate your time and energy, Jarrett, as always. Great discussion. We'll catch you on the next one. Thank you so much.
Looking forward to it, Jamie.